Good evening and morning. Pardon me, I am going to work for my writing. Welcome to my lecture on the persistence of the past, how 19th century women writers used ghost stories, great ghost stories, to bring about moral justice and comfort their readers. So um, I am American, but I've had the good fortune of having a mother of an Anglo background, and I've therefore been able to visit the UK a great deal while growing up. I'm a huge admirer of the British people and the literary culture, and um, I love ghost stories, especially British ghost stories. So um, I've been heavily absorbed, some would say obsessed with Gothic and ghostly folklore and fiction since grade school in the late 1970s. By then, the recovery of forgotten female writing, begun by feminist scholars in the early 60s, was in full swing. I frequented secondhand and Oxfam bookshops throughout my childhood, and I found a lot of stuff that was briefly reprinted and then went out of print again. I found a lot of out of print stuff from the 1940s and 50s, which would have maybe 15 stories by male writers, ghost stories, and then 2 or 3 by women ghost story writers. Elizabeth Gaskell's The Old Nurse's Tale is very often anthologized. Many of these other stories were pretty much forgotten. A lot of them were published in secondary women's magazines that were more in the Good Housekeeping mold, less in the Charles Dickens literary magazines mold or the St. James magazine mold. So they also got lost. Anyway,
Marla, I'm sorry
so
to interrupt. Can you turn your phone so we can see your face, please?
is that better?
That is better. Thank you. I know
Okay.
you're trying to do 2 things in 2 different
Okay.
directions. Thank you. Go right
Okay.
ahead.
Okay. So Elizabeth Gaskell is the most known writer I'm going to talk about today. Her complex and socially realistic novels and her Gothic stories and novellas that often have commonalities with her novels have consistently stayed in print, as have her best-selling novels. I don't think the majority of her novels have ever been out of print, like Mary Barton, Wives and Daughters, Sylvia's Lovers, Ruth, which I reread a few weeks ago, actually. And she's also known for her very influential biography of Charlotte Bronte, her friend. So Gaskell is the only writer I'm going to talk about today who's considered first order of 19th century Victorian female writers. In addition to Gaskell, I'm seeking to illuminate 4 second-tier female writers, all of them best-selling novelists in the second half of the 19th century, with prolific bodies of work, including several purely ghost or Gothic with supernatural hints stories apiece. So I'm going to change the title of this a little bit to The Persistence of the Past, Part 1, because I know I'm going to go over. So, and if you'll want me back, I will have more to say on these topics. But anyway, to proceed today, there were ghosts in literature prior to Victoria's ascendancy to the throne in 1837, but the genre really grew in the 1840s, in part because of Charles Dickens and his highly allegorical ghosts in Christmas Carol, 1843, and his subsequent yearly ghost stories in his periodicals, Household Words and All the Year Round. His contributors included Elizabeth Gaskell, Amelia B Edwards, and Wilkie Collins. From that point, the ghost story market really took off. It was a hugely popular and lucrative market that included holiday editions to be given as presents and turned folklore tales that had been told umpteen times into profit-making vehicles, which Dickens was fully aware of. The advertisement duty tax was abolished in 1853.
Perhaps the space bar.
There we go. There's Christmas Carol.
Perfect.
Okay. Here's a meeting for the repeal of taxes on knowledge, which was the colloquial term at St. Martin's Hall. St. James Magazine, Volume 1. It's hard to find screenshots and images of these old magazines. So there was a big growth in periodicals and magazines. Many of them were edited by female writers who also wrote supernatural stories for them. For example, Charlotte Riddell co-edited, ran, and wrote for St. James Magazine. From the mid-1840s throughout the rest of the 19th century, both famous and lesser-known authors tried out the short story ghost format at least once. Some of them weren't completely purely ghost story. George Eliot wrote The Lifted Veil, which is more about mesmerism and premonitions. I don't think she was that comfortable with that. Her stories have, her novels have a gothic quality to them. I don't think she liked the purely ghost story genre. So, but The Lifted Veil is an interesting read. So where did all of the ghosts come from, and why were they there in a time of so much technological and scientific growth? Were the advances in science too rapid a cultural change for people? Despite medical advancements, high child mortality and mothers' deaths during childbirth were still major factors well into the end of the 1800s. Parentless children who had anything of their parents' worldly goods could be in danger in the care of surviving family members entrusted with their care. 18 the Fox sisters, who were from New York. Okay. 1848 was a turbulent year of revolution and change. It was also the same year of the Fox sisters, who were most likely pranking their gullible mother and sisters in their farmhouse home in Idesville, New York, on April 1st, April Fool's Day. So they told of rapping sounds emanating from their bedroom walls. The sounds seemed to have an intelligence to them, according to the adolescent girls, and their mother, who wanted to believe them. Their story was eagerly seized upon by wannabe believers in the supernatural. It grew upstate, and then it continued on. It grew into a hugely influential news story on both sides of the pond. It was known in Australia. It's credited with bringing about the birth of 19th century spiritualism. In 1888, Maggie Smith went on stage at the New York Academy of Music and declared the entire story a hoax. She was paid by a local newspaper $1,500. She began her recanting with, "My sister Kate and I were very young children when this horrible deception began." For her confession, she seems to have lived out her life on her $1,500. She was estranged from the rest of her family, and she may have spent some of the money on drink. Anyway, the second half of the 19th century, wait a second. Okay. The second half of the 19th century was a singular period in which serious and systematic attempts were made to census the otherworldly outside of fiction. The Society for Physical Research in Britain began in London in 1882. Its stated purpose was to understand psychic or paranormal events. Its members included the chemists Sir William Crookes, physicist Sir Oliver Lodge, and the artist Louis Charles Pals. The American Society for Psychical Research opened in 1885 in New York City. It was founded by William James. Its stated purpose was also parapsychology. William's brother Henry fictionalized some of the spiritualists and their believers in his 1885 novel, The Bostonians. He attended some seances. He wrote The Turn of the Screw, obviously, but he also wrote a handful of other very psychologically driven, very interesting ghost stories, which we're not going to be talking about today, but they are worth addressing in the future. So I actually like some of them better than The Turning of the Screw. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Blithedale Romance, 1852, also addresses spiritualism. So, okay, this is Jon Snow. I'm not sure if Dr. Jon Snow, although they weren't known as doctor then yet. Okay, before I get to the women and their stories, I want to mention 19th century events in science and finance that had an immense influence on people's thoughts and beliefs. From 1817 through 1923, 6 cholera pandemics occurred consecutively and continuously over time. Increased commerce, migration, and pilgrimage really helped spread the transmission of the cholera. Late in this period, particularly 1879 to 1883, major scientific breakthroughs toward the treatment of cholera developed. The first immunization by Louis Pasteur, the development of the first cholera vaccine, and identification of the bacterium Vibrio cholera by Filippo Pacino and Robert Koch. Worldwide, the cholera outbreak was 1846 to 1860, but 1854 was an especially terrible year in London. In response to all of the real-life horror, scientific theories about miasma and germ theory became very popular. Jon Snow, and here he is the English physician credited with discovering the Broad Street pump as a source of infection in Soho. He was a founding member of the Epidemiological Society of London that was formed in May of 1850 in response to the cholera outbreak of 1849. He is regarded as the father of modern epidemiology. He was a vegetarian. He believed very strongly in researching things very carefully. So, on the basis of his exams for a water sample from the Broad Street pump, he convinced the local council to remove the handle of the well pump. He was very skeptical of the now discredited miasma theory, which held that diseases such as cholera were caused by bad, filthy air, which probably didn't help. But anyway, the miasma theory was finally completely abandoned in favor of the germ theory after 1880. So, meanwhile, during Jon Snow's experiments in the Meanwhile, during his experiments in the 1860s, Louis Pasteur developed modern germ theory. By proving the existence of invisible and infectious bacteria, he altered the Victorians' vantage point of what did and didn't pose a threat. People suddenly had to deal with the concept that things they couldn't see, smell, taste, or hear existed, and sometimes posed grave danger to them. It was definitely a game changer. So, other things that contributed to the Victorian fascination with unseen presences. Okay, we'll leave her. Other things that contributed were Protestant Reformation, going way back. So, ghosts were then regarded as figments of Catholic superstition, and you do see Catholic desires and beliefs are not completely extinguished in the Victorian imagination in their fiction. Then there were financial collapses. In the 19th century, they seemed to average one every decade or so, going back to around 1760. So, in Great Britain, there were nationwide ones in 1825, 26, 1837, and 1847. These were followed by the pandemic of 1857, the first worldwide economic crisis. This began in the American Midwest, traveled to New York, and went on to wreak global havoc in Liverpool, Glasgow, and London, before causing crashes in Paris, Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Vienna. These financial catastrophes and the social and physical toll that they brought certainly impacted the growth of the ghosts and Gothic literary genres. And certainly you do see money mentioned many times in a lot of these ghost stories, most famously in A Christmas Carol. Money occurs throughout. It's always an issue in all of these 19th century novels. So, many of the stories feature financial ruin interweaving with supernatural activity. Specters return from the other side to right perceived monetary wrongs on a regular basis. So, and in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, great wealth has to be redistributed at the end to have a positive ending, which probably is one of the reasons why the book has remained in print and is one of his most popular books. So Charlotte Riddell employs similar themes in her 1882 Christmas story, The Old House in Vauxhall Walk, which features a female Scrooge-like ghost who has taken her wealth to the grave with her. She bemoans her wasted life by endlessly picking up and dropping sovereigns. At the end of the story, the wealth goes to a living male relative. So, and here is Mrs. Gaskell, Elizabeth Gaskell. So, Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell is one of the greatest 19th century novelists and the most successful practitioner in London of industrial fiction. There's not too many people who don't have good feelings about her fiction. She was born in London in 1810 in the home that is now 93 Chain Walk, but grew up in Cheshire, Stratford-upon-Avon, and the north of England. She was the youngest of 8. Only she and her brother John lived past infancy. I think John later disappeared on an expedition, having to think about that. He was in the Navy, but he left it and he later disappeared. So I'm going to look at that. Okay, she was the youngest of 8. Only she and her brother John lived past infancy. Her father was a Unitarian minister in Lancashire. Her mother Elizabeth died 13 months after Elizabeth's birth. Elizabeth married the Unitarian minister William Gaskell in 1832. She spent 16 years working among the poor and traveling while she gave birth to 5 children. Her first daughter was stillborn in 1833. She had 4 more daughters and a son, William, who died in infancy. His loss was the catalyst for her enormously successful first novel, Mary Barton. In 1850, the Gaskells moved to 84 Plymouth Grove, now a Writers' House Museum in Manchester. Elizabeth wrote all of her remaining works there, including her famous biography of her friend Charlotte Bronte. The biography gives the reader a sense of learning about Elizabeth as well as Charlotte. The bulk of Elizabeth Gaskell's writing, particularly her novels, are arguably among the greatest books of the last 200 years, as well as her industrial novels, such as North and South. Go back. Such as North and South, Wives and Daughters. She wrote Gothic, and ghost tales. So, she wrote some very fine and creepy supernatural stories and novellas. She also wrote some mysteries that are purely mysteries without supernatural elements, but have strong Gothic feelings to them. The Old Nurse's Tale was written for the 1852 Christmas edition of Dickens' Household Words. It employs traditional ghost story devices. It begins with a second-person narrator, the children's nursemaid, Hester, telling the children about an incident from their mother's childhood. The story takes place in a rambling old mansion that seems underpopulated by people. There's a large organ that takes up the better part of a wall and a heavy old-fashioned furniture. Hester is relaying terrible events that happened long ago. A painting of an unseen family member from the past hangs facing the wall. The entire east wing is shut up. The organ is heard making music. Upon examination, it doesn't seem to have worked in years. Repeatedly, the ancientness and size of the mansion are contrasted with the youth and innocence of Rosamond, the orphaned and displaced child, and her 18-year-old nursemaid Hester, barely out of childhood herself and separated from her own family because of her need to earn a living. The combined pathos, social morality, and creepiness of the tale work, in part because of Elizabeth Gaskell's great storytelling ability and the morality and decency she's able to create in her characters, while at the same time reflecting their human complexities and flaws. Even in this short, fairly conventional, traditional ghost story, you recognize her messages that simply being humane and kind can aid people throughout life's hardships. So, however, part of the great popularity of these ghost stories is derived from their conventionality. They record tales that have been told many times before, often in an oral form, as Tracy has discussed when we were talking about M.R. James. Their layout implies cultural legacy and a great desire to correct moral wrongs. As readers, we are willing accomplices in a pattern that proceeds according to our expectations. There are usually two stories involved in these tales: what happened and the detection of what happened. The ghosts make the horror more palatable. So, okay, this is Dinah Maria Craik, also known as Dinah Mullock. She is not read that much anymore. The other women I'm talking about today have gone in and out of print more than Dinah Mullock, I think. The last few months are the first times I've really looked at her books. So she's best known for her best-selling novel, John Halifax, Gentleman. And there's a copy of it, an actual copy. John Halifax, Gentleman, published in 1857. It focuses on the Victorian middle class through the eyes of an orphan who overcomes all sorts of obstacles to become a wealthy and upstanding member of his community, who's greatly involved in his community's goings-on. He's very socially active. Miss Craik went on to have a quite successful writing career. She wrote out of economic necessity. She wrote children's stories that sold very well, but then became a very popular novelist for grown-ups and a writer of short stories for periodicals. She's one of the highest paid novelists of her time. Her short ghost story, The Last House in C Street, has a very charming opening paragraph, which I'm going to read actually. The Last House in C Street. Okay. I am not a believer in ghosts in general. I see no good in them. They come, that is, are reported to come so irrelevantly, purposefully, so ridiculously in short, that one's common sense as regards this world, one's supernatural sense of the other are alike revolted. Then 9 out of 10 capital ghost stories are easily accounted for, and in the 10th, when all natural explanation fails, one who has discovered the extraordinary difficulty there is in all society in getting hold of that very slippery article called a fact is strongly inclined to shake a dubious head, ejaculating, "Evidence, a question of evidence." But my unbelief springs from no dogged or contemptuous skepticism as to the possibility, however great the improbability, of that strange impression upon or communication to spirit and matter, from spirit wholly materialized, which is vulgarly called a ghost. There is the credulity more blind, no credulity more blind, no ignorance more childish than that of the sage who tries to measure heaven and earth and the things under the earth with the small 2-foot rule of his own brains. Dare we presume to argue concerning any mystery of the universe? It is inexplicable and therefore impossible? Oh. I read the opening of that and I really decided I wanted to include it. So I love her writing, actually. John Halifax which I started reading this week, it's a little more difficult. It's not the most straightforward narrative, and I can see why it's been more out of print than in print. But she writes good sentences and she does sweep you along. So I'm going to persevere with it. I've spent a lot of time reading these lost novels of second and third tier writers of the 19th century. So probably because I spent so much time in secondhand bookstores, and that's what I came upon. So nowadays, if I find a long out of print book, I'm a little more skeptical. I'm like, do I want to read this, or wouldn't I rather reread Bleak House or something? So, but anyway, let me go back to. Okay, so anyway, the narrator of The Last House in C Street then relays a long ago tale from Mrs. MacArthur's past, of that's the woman who was speaking to him, of how as a young woman she traveled with her parents and a young law student she was in love with to London. Soon afterwards, her mother, who is 8 months pregnant, becomes sick and has to return home. The father stays on and accompanies his daughter and the law student to see Hamlet that evening. It's afterwards mentioned that they greatly enjoyed seeing the actor Grimaldi playing Gravedigger too. That night, the daughter hears a tapping sound that resembles the sounds her mother uses at home to signal to her to come in, and her father simultaneously has a frightening premonition that something terrible has happened. It turns out that the mother has died in childbirth. The narrator must return home in order to care for the rest of the family, never marrying the law student, but instead she marries someone else when she's in her 30s. She's not unhappy with the person she marries, but there is a sense of wistfulness and looking back at the past with some regret. The story involves premonition, ghostly wrappings, and shows how chance events can alter personal histories, sometimes for the better and sometimes not. It's unusual because she marries someone who is not her first choice, but she makes a point throughout the story of saying that this was not necessarily the worst outcome that could have been. And it's also mentioned that the law student that she did not marry has become a friend of the family and frequently visits. The narrator of the story is also a listener. She bears witness to her friend over her long ago loss. Her calm response is soothing to the readers. From this very short, elegant little story, you can see why Dinah Craig was very successful as an author. And the moral justice of the story speaks to this young woman having to be responsible for her family when her mother died in childbirth, and also how easily people died in childbirth, how vulnerable women were in childbirth, and how it was just a fact of life. So it wasn't anything to debate or argue about. She simply said goodbye to her law student and went home. The story is set around, I think it's set around 1810 or 1820 or so. So you can really imagine how great a journey this is as well, to go from London back to where they're from. So, let's see. So, other very interesting facts about Dinah Mulloch Craig is that she adopted a baby girl who was abandoned on the road. The National Children's Home hadn't started experimenting with placing found children until much later, so this is interesting. She refused to give up her career when she married, and she was the primary supporter of her husband, which seems to be a commonality with a lot of these female writers. So I don't think it was the case with Mrs. Gaskell, though. So now we're going to come to three of my own personal favorites. There's Amelia B. Edwards. I'm not sure if you can see her dates on there. So Amelia B. Edwards is widely regarded as one of the finest ghost story writers of the 19th century. Her stories are really scary if anyone hasn't read her. She was a novelist, an Egyptologist when she finished her writing later in life, a traveler, and a journalist. In 1882, she co-founded the Egypt Exploration Fund. Her contributions in Egyptology earned her the nickname the Godmother of Egyptology. She wrote superb, let's see. Okay, there's her book, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, which is not a ghost story. And there's what's probably a 1950s or 60s collection of her stories by the style of the cover. So anyway, she wrote superb, truly frightening ghost stories with beautifully delineated, intelligent characters. Her tales have pathos, but are also genuinely creepy. In 1864, she wrote a very successful novel that's not about ghosts, it's about bigamy. It's called Barbara's History. It was published in the Saturday Review in Dickens' Household Words, which makes me think of Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, which came out around that time, also about bigamy. So it was obviously a popular topic. She contributed stories to Charles Dickens all the year round. Her story entitled Four Ghost Stories, which is actually one ghost story and pretty short, was attributed to Dickens well into the 20th century. It was commonplace for stories to be published without the author's byline. Four Stories had a sequel that was actually written by Dickens. It was entitled The Portrait Painter's Story. If you read the two stories consecutively, you will wonder how the Four Stories was mistaken for Dickens. It doesn't have the feeling of his prose. So, in what I believe to be the most powerful ghost story was an illusion, a Parsons story, 1881. A school inspector is sent to a remote and unfamiliar area called Pit End. He sees a tall teenaged boy with a fishing rod, meets the headmaster, who he has an instant aversion to, who appears to have a shadow of a boy around him who he claims to not see. Mr. Fraser, the inspector, first runs into the headmaster when he sees the boy with the fishing rod walking near him. He has another encounter with the headmaster where he sees a shadow of a boy around him. So the schoolmaster denies any knowledge of why there's a shadow of a boy around him. Mr. Fraser, the schoolmaster, realizes his old Oxford schoolmate, Mr. Wolstenholme, is the big ancestral landowner in Pit End, and he learns that he owns the working mines which border his property and employ many of the local men. So all of whom seem to have good feelings for Mr. Wolstenholme. Mr. Fraser sends him a note letting him know of his presence for a few days, and he's given a hearty welcome and is invited to stay on Mr. Wolstenholme's estate. Mr. Wolstenholme is an extremely good-natured and easygoing individual, but he's also away from Pit End most of the time. This is his first time visiting his estate in 5 years. And he's only there for a few weeks, it appears. He fills his house with lavish souvenirs from his travels. So, and I'm gonna, again, read from that. Let me just. Okay. This is about Mr. Wolstenholme's possessions. Is Carl Shelton one of your own mines? I asked. All of these pits are mine, he replied. I am king of Hades and rule the underworld as well as the upper. There is coal everywhere underlying these moors. The whole place is honeycombed with shafts and galleries. One of our richest seams runs under this house, and there are upwards of 40 men at work in it, a quarter of a mile below our feet here every day. Another leads right away under the park. Heaven only knows how far. My father began working it 5 and 20 years ago, and we have gone on working it ever since, yet it shows no sign of failing. You must be as rich as a prince with a fairy godmother. He shrugged his shoulders. So he then proceeds to take him and show him around the house at all the souvenirs he's brought home from his travels. He snatched up a lamp and led the way through a long suite of unfurnished rooms, the floors of which were piled high with packing cases of all sizes and shapes, labeled with the names of various foreign ports and the addresses of foreign agents innumerable. What did they contain? Precious marbles from Italy and Greece and Asia Minor, priceless paintings by old and modern masters, antiquities from the Nile, the Tigris and the Euphrates, enamels from Persia, porcelain from China, bronzes from Japan, strange sculptures from Peru, arms, mosaics, ivories, wood carvings, skins, tapestries, old Italian cabinets, painted bride chests, Etruscan terracottas, treasures of all countries of all ages, never even unpacked since they crossed that threshold, which the master's foot had crossed but twice during the 10 years it had taken to buy them. Should he ever open them, ever arrange them, ever enjoy them? Perhaps, if he became weary of wandering, if he married, if he built a gallery to receive them. If not, well, he might found and endow a museum or leave things to the nation. What did it matter? Collecting was like fox hunting. The pleasure was in the pursuit and ended with it. So it's an interesting segue in a ghost story. What is a ghost story? So, okay. Anyway, there are plans to continue with the story. There are plans to take Mr. Fraser into the mines, but on the night before his tour, one of the mines is flooded and the entire lake that's partially over the mine disappears into it, leaving the corpse of a young boy and a fishing rod. The boy turns out to be the illegitimate and possibly mentally disabled son of the headmaster. He had beaten him to death, possibly accidentally when he was beating him. His intention was not to kill him, but at all rates, he had beaten him to death and hidden the boy's corpse in the lake a while back. So that's the last ending of any of these stories I'm going to give away. I'm just going to lightly touch on two other stories. So, Was It an Illusion is a powerful story that presents the reader with some interesting things to ponder. Why is the narrator bears witness the school inspector? This seems to speak to the absent state involvement and supervision of unwanted, often illegitimate children. The relationship between the inspector and his wealthy landowner, Oxford classmate is interesting. Does the lake disinterring the corpse reflect the interference of the mining in the natural environment? In other words, the industrial disruption of what's pure and untouched. Why is it the industrial mining that exposes the crime? And why does Edwards include the details of so many of the souvenirs? So, okay, there is Charlotte Riddell. There you can see her dates, 1832 from Ireland, and she died in 1906 in Kent, England. I think she passed a large part of her life in London as a working writer. So, okay, I'm going to talk a little about her and Margaret Oliphant today, in again the hope that you'll have me back to cover both writers in much greater depth. But they both have vast bodies of work, including and outside of excellent ghost stories. Both also were the chief financial supporters of their families, a commonality they share with Donna Marie Craik and several other female writers of the Victorian era. So, Charlotte Riddell was of Irish background. She uses her background, subsequent knowledge of Ireland, in several of her novels and ghost stories. For example, Hertford O'Donnell's Warning, 1867, a fine ghost story about a banshee whose wail precipitates a family death. A banshee is a folkloric motif. Supposed to be you hear the wails in old homes, and it means that someone there is going to die, or usually it means death comes in threes. Let's see. And here's some of her mostly out of print books. The Haunted River and three other ghostly novellas, which, this is probably from the 80s or 90s, edited by Richard Dalby, who also edited the book of Arago, Forgotten Ghost Stories by 19th-century women writers that I put up earlier. Richard Dalby was a terrific anthologist of current modern times. He died last year. He was only 67. His library is for sale now. So he lived in England. He was a nice man. He answered a few emails I had sent him over the years asking specific questions. Anyway, she both in her ghost stories and a series of well-received novels chronicling the lives of people deeply connected to the 19th century financial sector, money figures heavily. In one of her non-spectral novels, she likens commercial working men's daily routines to graveyards in which they are buried. So many of her novels had a Gothic feeling to them, apparently, even if they weren't specifically about ghosts. Some of her work seems to have dovetailed with Wilkie Collins. She was the author of 56 books, novels, novellas, and short stories. Her ghost stories go in and out of print, and actually, here's one of my copies. You can see it. So the Wordsworth Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural have been really good for recovering a lot of these short stories. She edited and wrote for St. James Magazine, popular and well-known literary journal in the 1860s. Here it is. Oh, here's the title page. I have about 300 of these anthology collections. If anyone wants ever a screenshot of any of the table of contents, I notice Amazon doesn't print the table of contents in a lot of these books anymore, and a lot of the small booksellers don't do it either. So if anyone is looking to not duplicate whatever stories, they do have. So, let's go back. Okay, getting ahead of myself. Okay. In 1882, she published Weird Tales, which is considered by many Gothic and horror critics, amateur and otherwise, among the best ghost story collections ever written. She has been called one of Great Britain's leading novelists during the 1860s and 70s, but she has been mostly out of print. Her novels are hard to find. I think her ghost stories and ghostly novellas are probably more interesting. There are elements in her work that sometimes resemble several of her contemporaries, again, Wilkie Collins, Mary Elizabeth Braden. Her short story, The Open Door, 1892, is considered one of her best. It's about an indigent and self-described as the only ugly specimen in his family, young man who takes a job investigating a haunted manor house in the country that has a door that won't stay shut and a problem with tenants who keep moving out abruptly. So it has no relation to Margaret Oliphant's more famous The Open Door, 1881. But we are in the 1881, 1882. Oliphant's story, The Open Door, is regarded as one of the finest ghost stories ever written. But I would rather go back to Mrs. Riddell and again read one more paragraph in her Open Door. I love her writing. This is a very charming story that starts out very innocently and then works up into a revealing of, horror and so on, of bad acts committed and, the desire for moral and social justice. So anyway, The Open Door. Some people do not believe in ghosts, for that matter. Some people do not believe in anything. There are persons who even affect incredulity concerning that open door at Ladlow Hall. They say it did not stand wide open, that they could have shut it, that the whole affair was a delusion, that they are sure it must have been a conspiracy, that they are doubtful whether there is such a place as Ladlow on the face of the earth, that the first time they are in Meadowshire, they will look it up. So, as I said, I love her writing. So anyway, I'm going to go now to Margaret Oliphant, who is Scottish. She was born in Wallingford, United Kingdom, and she died in Wimbledon, London, England. Oh. She was a Scottish novelist. She wrote a lot of history books, and she wrote books with strongly religious and spectral themes combined. And this is actually my book, but I put it up as a screenshot. She also wrote The Chronicles of Carlingford, which has been compared, the series has been compared to both the Trollope series. It's about a small town life with and how it, around the rectory and the sordid assorted rectors and curates and so on. It's very female centric and very female centered. And there's about 7 or 8 of these books in the series. They're very compulsively readable. They're different than Trollope. They seem less concerned with public life and a little more interior than Trollope's Barchester series. So, and they definitely are worth reading. She's one of the more best. She deserves to stay in print and she should be read more. Her Carlingford Chronicles, which are not ghostly, are terrific. So here's The Library Window, another one of her ghost stories. This is also an excellent tale. So, but I want to mention her short story, The Open Door, which does share a title, but not much else, with Charlotte Riddell's The Open Door. They're about a year apart. The Open Door is not about a house. It's about a door that's mysteriously left of a house. The house no longer stands, but there are comings and goings of people through the door that are mysterious. The house is a rental, and of course, people rent it and have experiences there that make them understand why the rent there is so low. So, and anyway, so she's definitely worth reading, and I would like to talk more about her in the future, but I am going to wind down now. I just want to ask a few simple questions about why these short stories were so popular. I know I keep coming back to this. So, well, what can a short story do that a novel can't? That's the big thing. A lot of these ghost stories seem to function as social and moral justice fables, delivered when actual earthbound corporal justice is impossible. The stories function almost as wish fulfillments, their spectrality appeasing the reader's need for tidy, happy endings in real life. The stories tend to involve a good deal of detective work, revenge. Often this leads to possible solutions involving ethics, kindness, concepts which sound very easy to grasp at on the surface, but in the increasingly complex modernity of the Victorian era, had a powerful lure in selling prose and creating a feeling of comfort to people. So that's it for today.